everybody, and welcome to the Goot Reaction. I'm your host, Joe Goot, and I'm here with my main man from the Midwest, as always. And this week is a little interesting. We're going to be kind of diving into the topic of the arts this week. And my buddy listened to an awesome podcast called Offline, and they were discussing Fight Club. And we both listened to it a couple times, and the thoughts flowed. And we both wrote down a bunch of notes and had some great memories of a movie that we both not necessarily grew up with, but in kind of our formative years, watched a significant number of times. And so, Fight Club was kind of came out in '99, and that was for us some college years for us, and we both watched it like so many times back then and since. And leading up to this episode, I kind of wanted to just give it to keep some distance from having seen it, and so I didn't watch it again. I listened, like I said, I listened to the Offline episode, Offline again being the name of the podcast, twice, just to absorb all that, because they had some really great points and they went over a lot of interesting angles on it. And so I listened to that twice, but I didn't rewatch the film. And I wanted to have kind of a almost that sort of nostalgic memory of it and the feelings of when I last saw it fully, just kind of there for me, and then really look at the more of a high level philosophical take on it. That's the direction that I sort of went. And so for me, that was my approach. And what about you?
Yeah, so I actually took the different approach. So I decided I needed to give it a fresh watch because I, like you said, watched it a bunch of times when we were younger. I had watched it maybe once, I'm going to say a number of years ago, and kind of just a watch while I was doing some other things. But I really sat down this time and wanted to give it, like I said, a fresh watch with a bit more years of life under my belt and see if I felt the same way about it as now as I did back then. So
Yeah, interesting. Okay, cool. So one of the interesting things that the Offline folks said was that it was a very Gen X movie, and of course we're kind of on the edge of Gen X, going into millennial generation a few years after us. And so I thought that was interesting that they really looked at it through that lens, and they were examining specifically its impact on like 4chan culture. And that podcast focuses on like how it films impact technology and the internet and those and culture and those sorts of things. So we wanted to take a little bit of a different approach to this analysis, expanding on a lot of what they said, because they had a lot of awesome points. I think everyone should go out and listen to that show. Um, but my two main themes that I came away with after listening to that show and ruminating on a lot of those points were the fact that there's a lot about pain and suffering in order to feel something real, and then sharing that with others, and also that nihilism is the answer to life. Those are the two high level themes for me, again thinking back on what I remembered from the film and the analysis from the show. So one of the first main points then that I wanted to talk about in regard to pain and suffering is that I think there's with those characters from the film and the narrator, there's a lot of misplaced anger and then people taking their pain out on others. And I know this is kind of a dark direction to first go with this, but just thinking about mass shooters or people that resort to violence, and they're just so disillusioned and in pain. And I think just wanting to deliver that pain to other people. And especially, I think, with mass shooters, I think a lot of them go into what they're doing not expecting to make it out alive. So their final act in this world is to make other people suffer just like they feel like they've suffered. And so that's, I'm not a psychologist by any means, but that's kind of my read on seeing a lot of those situations and hearing about what's in those manifestos that some of them write and those sorts of things. So I think it's a very similar thing with this film. If you think about the line where after Edward Norton's character just beats the ever loving piss out of Jared Leto, he said, "I felt like destroying something beautiful." And I think that kind of says it all. That kind of sums up that point for me, him with that quote, and just feeling just this existential pain and this just wanting to share it, just wanting to make other people feel that as well. So, and another thing I thought of too but what's interesting is that in all those different the actual Fight Club scenes, after they fight, after they inflict so much pain and damage on each other, they hug, they celebrate. after they've shared that pain, they've gone through this collective bonding experience brought about through suffering. And so there's the sharing of the pain, the giving of it to each other, but then there's this celebration of it. And that's sort of what brings it together for them, as they see it as a positive after they've shared their pain.
Yeah, so man, some interesting takes there. I'm gonna go to the second part first. So I think, again, having just freshly rewatched it, like, I mean, I just finished it last night, was I'm gonna throw an extra word in there that you didn't use, which was feeling the pain. Feeling, for a lot of them, I think, was that sense of feeling kind of alive. You
Hmm.
know, like they're most of them were in that situation. They felt like their lives were pretty mundane. Jack, I'm going to refer to him as Jack, the narrator, because he always
Yeah.
made references. I am
Yeah.
Jack's colon. um, that was driving him into the situation he was in was kind of that feeling that he had nothing meaningful in his life, and that it was, in a way, his life was void of feeling. And if nothing else, when he went and joined this fight club, or started it really, he was feeling alive through that pain, which, I mean, I suppose we could get into a lot of discussion on what was driving that. Um, the other part you mentioned, because that was something I keyed on when I watched it again too, is that when he did beat up Jared Leto's character, and he said, I felt like destroying something beautiful. That happened right after they, as a group, went and basically threatened the police commissioner. And as they were
Mhm.
coming out of that, um, the way Jack was seeing it, which again, you could argue in those situations where him and Tyler were both present in his mind, but really they weren't, right? There was only, his body was only occupying one of those two spaces. He envisioned Tyler kind of cozying up to Jared Leto's character, almost like, and he felt sort of replaced. So there was a jealousy aspect there too.
Mhm.
And when he came out of that, I actually felt like, yeah, he felt like destroying something beautiful, which kind of gets to where some of the pranks they were doing, they were destroying art pieces, they were, defacing
Mhm.
billboards, they were doing some of those things. But there was an extra element of jealousy and extra rage, I think,
Mhm.
fueling that moment too. So it was, I
Yeah.
think he felt like, still saw Tyler as another person, but he saw him as kind of his, more in a way, like their
Mhm.
relationship was stronger than even the ones they were forging with those other people. And when he
Yeah.
saw someone else kind of infringing on that, he reacted. It reminded me in a way of kind of his angst towards Marla, because
Mhm.
Marla was showing up at their house and in his mind having sex with Tyler, while he was off on there's a lot of spoilers in this podcast, folks, for if you haven't seen the movie. So you really need to either watch the movie and listen to that other podcast. And I always say, if you have never seen the movie, watch it and then watch it again, because you'll pick up on a lot of stuff you didn't pick up the first time. But yeah, when he never felt great about Marla in the first place, but when she was coming over and in his mind, having sex with Tyler, and then they'd have their little interactions in the morning, and to him, he's just seeing her for the first time, and very kind of that kind of like resentful feeling, like, why are you here getting between Tyler and I? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And so it kind of felt like he had that same feeling about Jared Leto's character then later.
Yeah, no, I think that's an awesome point, and that's that sort of wanting of intimacy and wanting of that sort of deep connection, and then feeling threatened when when there is something that comes between the two of them, or depending on which character it is at the time. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think the earlier thing you said of the the feeling aspect of it, and trying to find something real amongst just this monotonous dead end sort of life that Jack feels like he's in. That was another point that I had that I wanted to talk about, which is kind of the whole like generation of men looking for meaning and belonging. And what they do then is they form their own tribe to not only get validation, but also sort of a permission to be bad. And so they back feelings and desires with each other, and so they kind of encourage each other to do these things that they end up doing, but also looking for guidance and an authority to submit to. So they have this sort of misplaced trust and allegiance, which is interesting. They towards the part of the movie where they start to go from just the fight clubs to the Project Mayhem, they conform to this authority and the guidance of Tyler, and yet it's sort of interesting that they're trying to get away from conforming to society, but yet they're conforming to a different authority, which I thought was kind of an interesting contradiction there. And I think to expand on that, like if we think about capitalism and how it's created this whole class of just base consumers and worker bees churning away life, looking for happiness, looking for fulfillment, but essentially just succumbing to the system and the rules in place to keep them subdued. So there's no real meaning, no real satisfaction, just grinding and surviving. And so they're looking for a purpose, but they still want structure and a system to exist within. So they're battling against this meta structure, but they're creating their own structure within that, apart from that, excuse me, to try to destroy it.
I think in a lot of ways, everybody's looking for some structure. You've mentioned it before in other conversations we've had, but a lot of people in life are always kind of looking for that authority figure, looking for something. I think a lot of people find it, not to pick on religion, not that I won't sometimes, but I think a lot of people find it in the church, right? They find it in a priest-like figure. Some people in the last decade or so are finding it in certain political figures. Anybody can take that however they want. But yeah, it's like I think people sometimes mistake, and maybe this will get onto your nihilism topic a little bit. Like I think when they don't like the system they're in, what they think they want, or they'll say they want, is a breakdown of the system, no system to exist. But really what they want is a system that they're comfortable in. What jumped out to me when I watched the movie back too was, like I said, it was crazy. Just 20 years on, I guess 25 if I'm doing my math right, when it came out, just and having more life experience under my belt, the different ways I looked at things within that movie. So how much, not just the fact that they were following Tyler and Tyler Durden's guidance, but he laid out rules for them when they showed up at the house. You must have X amount of, a couple of pairs of all black clothes. They all ended up shaving or most of them ended up shaving their head the same. Nobody had a name anymore, right? He really kind of, I don't know. It's hard to, I can't quite put my finger on how I want to say it, but like where they felt they had these mundane lives, he actually stripped what uniqueness they had almost away. And somehow they felt, I guess, a freedom within that. And then the other thing I was going to say real quick too about how you said, you pointed out the fact that they went from fighting, and that seemed to be enough of an outlet to go on and doing other things. I think it's just reminds me like a lot of addiction cases, right? Where they were getting their certain fix for a while, and then it became not enough. They had to expand that into other things. Most of the time, though, they really weren't hurting other people too badly. Like they did have the, even when he gave him the homework assignment to get in a fight with a complete stranger, he told him lose the fight.
Yeah.
Right. You're not getting into it to inflict damage, but you're getting into it to lose the fight. Essentially, maybe give that other person that feeling of, which not everybody wants to get in a fight necessarily, but that's sort of that feeling of winning. There was a weird, I shouldn't even say weird, there was an interesting angle there of how much some of those things he really was trying, in his strange way, trying to benefit society. It wasn't about inflicting pain, and it wasn't about like hurting people. It was, in his way, he was thinking he was helping them.
Yeah. Well, the Raymond K. Hessel example is very emblematic of that, right? It just scares the living crap out of this guy, thinking he's going to die, but He was just trying to focus him and give him direction, strip everything away and pursue what you want to pursue because like he also says we're dying one moment at a time basically, and so get on with living, and so yeah, I think that's very true. And to your point about individuality and identity there, that you first mentioned, I wrote something down about that specifically because that was really, again, I think another contradiction that I saw, that I found interesting and wanted to explore a little bit. But so I have in my notes that media never tries to tell us what we want, what we should desire, who we should be. But the men in Project Mayhem and the Fight Club, they struggle against the narrative and they seek to define themselves and find their own true desires. However, that's essentially juxtaposed with the rules of the group, where they no longer have their own identities. They no longer have any individuality, really. So, what's funny though is it kind of highlights the almost childish nature of their fight against the system because we'll get into the nihilism stuff in a little bit here, but one of the things is you try to break everything down, including yourself. So, you're essentially battling for freedom. And to do that, you need to really, truly, radically identify and define your own self. And so, this whole project is about stripping all that away. And so they're encouraged to break everything down, including themselves, to start anew with a fresh meaning and purpose that actually matters. So while they also conform to a collective mission as a whole, not individual goals or purpose, and for them, it's really only through conformity can they battle capitalism and societal norms through nonconformity. So this whole group is nonconformist, but they're actually conforming the rules and norms of this new group that they created. So I guess in one way, they are defining themselves. They are stripping away individuality and identity, but they are defining themselves and they're creating rules for themselves, which is that sort of let's break down society to create a better one. So they're almost creating their own new society within itself and defining it in a way that works for them in a way to battle the larger capitalism and society as a whole. So I just thought that was very interesting in that approach to sometimes you have to adopt the systems and processes of what you're fighting against in order to be effective.
Yeah. So as you were saying that, it made me think too. They were conforming to a new system, but the system was based on, I don't want to say nothing, but like you said, stripping away the individuality. So I think of that line where it's kind of a little monologue where with Brad Pitt, and I can't remember everything he said, or Tyler's Tyler, the character Tyler. I can't remember every exact word he says, but he ends it and it gives that kind of shaky camera effect. He's like, "You're not your fucking khakis." You know what I mean? You're not the car you drive. You're not you're not your fucking khakis. And
You're not your job.
yeah. And I think what's key to that is in a way by saying, okay, everybody dressed the same, plain black, dressed the same. Like I said, most of them shaved their heads. A couple of them still had hair. The one guy had a little bit of a mohawk. Jared Leto's character still had the bright blonde hair. But they didn't have a name. They didn't have anything by which any one of them was trying to compete with another one of them, right? Like nobody named Bill was trying to differentiate himself as Bill. He wasn't trying to acquire anything or attain anything that set Bill apart from John or Mike. You know what I mean? So it almost like removed all of that sense of competition in a way that is often what drives people in a capitalistic society to acquire more goods, to acquire those fucking khakis, to acquire that car and acquire that job. So it was a system based on taking away any of those consumeristic urges. I think a key thing too was how the goal was to make that house they lived in completely like self-sustaining, right? They had guys gardening, they had guys cleaning, they had guys, it was just this completely functioning like anthill of people that was trying to remove any dependence really on the outside world.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too that really the only time they got their identity back was if they died. When they said Bob's name as sort of
Robert Paulson.
Robert
His name
Paulson,
is Robert Paulson.
When he passed away on that prank gone bad, then he was finally given his identity back.
But the only thing that really drove that was Jack's sort of kind of I guess breaking through to his original humanity in a sense of like, no, wait a minute, this is a friend that I had prior to this, and it was just on the cusp of his realization that he was, okay, spoiler everybody, that he was actually Tyler. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was where he was also having that internal struggle of, wait a minute, maybe this whole thing is going too far. This has gone too far now that this guy died. And no, this isn't just some nameless figure. This was my friend, Robert
Mm-hmm.
Paulson. So it wasn't so much that the group felt that, it was Jack sort of even starting to break away from Tyler and the rules that Tyler had
Yeah.
set for the group that even brought that idea about. So it wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily a group function, a group idea until he sort of just reacted.
Yeah. But they took it as a rule or as a new tradition because of how he reacted. That was sort of the
Well, because they saw
but
him
that
because to them he
is
was
the
Tyler.
leader.
Yeah,
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 exactly. So they said, okay, so this must be how we do things. And so they just went with it, which is also again kind of the that funny nonconformity conformity that kind of goes hand in hand with the group like that. Like you wouldn't say they were a cult necessarily, but there were kind of some elements of that you could see.
yeah. It's pretty close.
You've got your charismatic leader, you've got your uniforms, you've got your isolation, you've got your mission, you've got your gospel, which is essentially whatever Tyler says. Very, very interesting parallels there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think it was pretty safe to call that a cult of sorts.
Yeah. Yeah, and another interesting thing that I was thinking of was around just an outlook on life and how this partly relates to what they were talking about in the offline podcast, but where you have Andrew Tate and the manosphere and this just sort of attitude of just take and hustle and manipulate your way to what you want. Nothing is genuine. The world is nasty and cruel, so be the same right back. So basically, that whole thing of just be a real man in society, you need to take and manipulate and do whatever you need to do to hustle to get what you want, and other people don't matter, they're just marks. And so that sort of attitude I think is out there, not commenting on the movie necessarily, but as a response to leading into the nihilism discussion, part of the discussion, where again the world is just, he's essentially saying the world is meaningless, and so you need to just exploit it. And so many young men I think have fallen into that sort of mentality, and it's really sad, and I think it's a sort of an indictment on the lack of positive influential figures out there in society, where someone like him, someone like Andrew Tate, can have mental control over so many young men and sort of take that ennui, that just general dissatisfaction with life and the world around them, and manipulate them into being like him. And he's just a miserable bastard, and I can't say enough bad things about him. But it's just sort of taking the conditions that are out there and the people that are under those conditions, and then manipulating it to get rich yourself. And that's a terrible thing. But that's just another sort of logical end of where I think a lot of people find themselves right now.
Yeah, I've always been kind of on the fence about whether what he's exploiting in people kind of a nihilistic, doesn't matter, so take what you want attitude, or tapping into that idea that there's something you deserve that you're not getting, and kind of more of a sense of entitlement. And that to me goes to a lot of, I'm gonna be careful a little bit what I say here, I guess. There's definitely a crisis among especially young men, but I'm not so sure it's about perception, right?
Yeah.
White men have had it their way for a long time, and I think for the most part, and people are going to disagree potentially with this, but we still basically do, and
Yeah.
we're given, uh, there's a lot of advocacy for rights and equality of others, and some people can't see that as a balancing; they see it as a taking. Right? You're taking something from
Hmm.
me and giving it to someone else, and people are going to have their legitimate feelings about something that or a lot of that. But I think that's what really is. I always felt he's kind of tapping into maybe more than anything is, hey, there's something you deserve and you're not getting it, right? So here's how you're gonna get it. You're just gonna go take it, right? you know.
Yeah, it's that like incel mentality too, where they feel that they deserve to have a pretty girlfriend, and because they don't means that there's something wrong with the women, not them. So it's this sort of misplaced, again, misplaced anger, misplaced grievance with other things instead of looking internally or just saying, "Hey, other people are finally achieving some manner of equality. That's great. It's not a zero sum game. It's not taking from me to give to them. It's just them kind of coming up to something resembling parody, not parody yet, of course, but yeah. So I definitely think that's a good point and another strong driver of that and how we can get away with that is tapping into that kind of thing. Um,
Well, and so what else starts to resonate with those guys is messages from certain leaders, politicians that, hey, a woman's place is by your side, to give you children and to do this, that, and the other thing. That just sort of feeds into that whole idea of, well, yeah, I'm supposed to have a girlfriend or wife because that's how it's supposed to be. That's their job, right? Is to someone's supposed to come be my wife. I mean, hey, you know, we both came up in the world here. It ain't easy, right? You're trying to, you
right.
know, getting someone to finding someone you love and that you want to love you back is takes a little bit of work. You know what I mean?
Yep.
You don't want to take the work out of it. You
Right.
know.
Yeah. Meaningless achievement is, or an easy achievement is usually not as satisfying and often won't last. So, yeah, to your point too, a lot of that is working on yourself and making yourself a valuable, worthwhile partner. And instead of just expecting someone to just take all of you no matter what, it's like, no, I mean, that's a great sentiment, but I think you do need to put yourself into a position where you are a good partner to someone else before you can really expect, to find someone that would take you.
Yeah. Well said.
All right, so let's jump into my second theme that came to mind around this, and that is nihilism, because I think nihilism is a huge part of the group's philosophy in the film, and really it's about tearing this world down to build a better one. Nothing really matters. There's no point to life, so let's start fresh by breaking down this whole current world. I think that's kind of the overall mentality of Project Mayhem, and so I'll just do a quick definition of nihilism. Nihilism is the belief that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated. It is often associated with extreme pessimism and a radical skepticism that condemns existence. A true nihilist would believe in nothing, have no loyalties, and no purpose other than perhaps an impulse to destroy. So I found this quote interesting. It was from an early writing of anarchist leader Mikhail Bakunin, and he wrote in one of his early treatises that is still identified with nihilism today. He said, quote, "Let us put our trust in the eternal spirit which destroys and annihilates, only because it is the unsearchable and eternally creative source of all life. The passion for destruction is also a creative passion." And so I thought that was interesting because Fight Club members, Project Mayhem, they're creative and they're very mischievous in the ways of attacking corporate symbols and capitalism. So they make soap out of the fat that people paid to have removed. They blow up corporate art. They feed hordes of birds who then crap all over expensive cars. And so I think they're really, that quote interested me because it highlights that in their pursuit of tearing down capitalism and societal norms, they're being creative. They're passionate about what they're doing, and they put a lot of planning and effort into these increasingly destructive pranks that they do.
Yeah, and kind of what they're doing in that is they're challenging, because they're challenging the notion that you should think that thing you have is important. Your pretty car now has bird crap all over it. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I don't know. I know that's an interesting take, the creative creative passion part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's not really something I've thought about in that direction, but yeah, again, a very very interesting quote from an early anarchist that was kind of involved in the nihilistic movement there. So another thing, so I was doing a lot of reading in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, again, about nihilism, and one of the other things they mentioned was that, by rejecting man's spiritual essence in favor of a solely materialistic one, nihilists denounce God and religious authority as antithetical to freedom. And that's another thing that they essentially do. Even though Tyler says our great war is a spiritual one, it's essentially rejecting all forms of authority in the world. And so religious and moral authority would be one of those things. Their fight against capitalism is a stand-in for God and spiritual truth. So they're fighting against that. And so though they also simultaneously reject material things, specifically giving up their identities, their possessions, their autonomy, the only thing that exists is the mission and the collective. And so they're essentially saying that, in my thing, in sort of a more religious angle of that, they're saying capitalism, society, culture, that's God and spiritual truth. And so they're just totally rejecting that. And they're more in line with materialism, even though they do give up their own materialistic pursuits, which is kind of interesting. So I think there's certainly a difference between materialism as a philosophical approach and being materialistic, but they just happen to share the base word there. But I do think that you could look at it, one way to look at it would be to say that they're rejecting God and any sort of objective spiritual truth in their pursuit of destruction.
Well, there is the scene, and I know I just watched the movie, so I should remember better. I believe it's the scene where Tyler's explaining to Jack how to make soap, and then he ends up giving him that chemical burn on the hand. And
Mm-hmm.
part of what he's saying is you have to accept the fact that he says a few different things, but ultimately he lands with God probably hates you, and you need to accept that, and stop. Um, not that Jack appeared to be a religious person, but I think in that painful moment he was. I think at one point he says, "Oh God, this," and that
Yeah.
gets Tyler going on. Hey, you gotta stop that idea right now. You gotta accept the fact that most likely God doesn't like you. So yeah, there's definitely an attack on. Yeah, I shouldn't say an attack, but a position on religion and spirituality. He doesn't say that God doesn't exist or anything like that, but he goes even further to say, "Oh, there's potentially one, and you just have to accept the fact that he doesn't like you and maybe punishing you."
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So there are a few different types of nihilism, or like subsets of nihilism, and one is political nihilism, which is associated with the belief that the destruction of all existing political, social, and religious order is a prerequisite for any future improvement. And so thinking about that in the context of the film is, that they wanted to disrupt the financial system and stable order to reset the world for everyone. And, they believe that in order to create something better, we must first destroy the current systems. While for Nietzsche, who is the accepted kind of father of nihilism, who kind of quantified the specifics of it in Will to Power, there is no objective order or structure in the world except what we give it. So they want to give it a reboot starting from zero, where everyone has a fresh chance to define themselves, to create meaning, and to be free. Ethical nihilism, or otherwise known as moral nihilism, is another aspect, and that rejects the possibility of absolute moral or ethical values. Instead, good and evil are nebulous, and values addressing such are the product of nothing more than social and emotive pressures. which I think is interesting. We could probably do an entire episode on objective versus subjective morality and things of that nature. But again, in the context of the film, they believe what they're doing is right and necessary and can't be judged bad by any existing moral framework. So good and bad are completely relative. And for them, the ends justify the means. Um, and finally, existential nihilism is the notion that life has no intrinsic meaning or value. And it is no doubt the most commonly used and understood sense of the word today. So that's kind of the standard view when people think of nihilism. It's that there's life has no meaning, which is interesting because there was another quote that I pulled from the film that really speaks to this aspect of it specifically, where it was, quote, "You are not special, you are not a beautiful and unique snowflake, you are the same decaying organic matter as everything else. We are all part of the same compost heap." So I thought that was really interesting from Tyler when they were going through and just starting to construct the house and starting to build their own self-sustaining little universe there. And he was just basically saying, like, no one here is special. You're all being driven by the same purpose. You all have to work together. There's no hierarchy other than just me and the rest of us, but you're not unique. You're not special. There really is nothing about you that's any better or any worse than anyone else. So, and then I'll finish with Jean-Paul Sartre, who lived through the 1900s and who's the father of existentialism. His defining preposition for the movement is that existence precedes essence. So really what that means is that kind of rules out any ground or foundation for establishing an essential self or a human nature, which I think just backs up that the meaning behind the quote, that there is really nothing special about you. There's no essential self behind you. You're just literally a bag of meat, and you now have a purpose, but it's nothing individual or unique about you specifically. There's nothing that nothing you were born with that defines you as a person. Existence precedes essence.
Well, that's interesting. That makes me think back to the identity episode we did
Mhm.
a couple back, or it might be, I forget, not sure where it is in line in terms of getting released, but you and I have talked before, and I know this is something that will trigger some people out there. But if we think about, I referred to the house where the guys lived in that movie as kind of an anthill, right? Where everybody, just a
Mhm.
bunch of worker ants just going around doing their jobs. Kind of ties into the idea that at the end of the day, we're all just animals, but we have this bit of consciousness or something, whatever drives that that need for identity, that need for differentiation, that need for, I have something about me that makes me unique, different than you. Some people take that a step farther, and I have something about me that makes me better than you, or I have this, I have that, or I am, I have bigger muscles, or I have, a nicer car, I have whatever, cute, prettier, partner. Um, there's something, in us that drives that thing for a lot of people. Um, but yeah, if we get back to sort of the animalistic sort of nature of things, obviously there's things in the animal world, and I guess I'm getting a little rambly here, but I think about like peacocks or something where they have something pretty about them that they use to attract their mate, but one doesn't necessarily look drastically different than another. I don't think any male,
Mhm.
while they're competing, they're not worried that they look a certain way. I think they're worried about that they look good enough to achieve their goal, but they're not necessarily, well, I guess in a way they are competing with each other, but I mean
Mhm.
it feels different, you know what I mean? But there's something in us
Yeah.
that just that little extra that kind of drives that identity piece that says I have to be unique in some way.
Mhm.
And what you're talking about seems to really pick away at that. Pick.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I personally subscribe to that. I mean, I would consider myself more of an absurdist than an existentialist, where essentially meaning that, life is absurd and we have to confront that head on. And so just by just existing, by just defining ourselves, we battle against the absurdity, the kind of meaninglessness of life. But also, the existentialist movement is something I identify with quite a bit. And again, I do believe that there's nothing like a soul, for example, that would be that essence, kind of existing first before existence, where I think existence precedes essence is my truth anyway. So one other thing, kind of going back to sort of a religious take on this, is that, and I'll kind of finish my part with this, is that with them tearing down the financial system to try to reset everyone, I was thinking it was actually almost kind of like the rapture, where, supposedly God will remake the earth into this paradise for believers. And essentially it's a grand reset. All history is gone. Only believers exist. The world is just this grand utopia. And so I thought it was interesting. I don't know if Polonyuk, the writer of Fight Club, was thinking along these lines, that parallel between sort of this great religious reset, this great spiritual remaking of the world, versus Project Mayhem trying to do that on Earth before the rapture. But I just thought that was an interesting parallel. I don't know if there was anything to it or not, but
Yeah, that is interesting. I guess that's the one thing neither one of us did do, was really do much research on. Because I'll admit, I never read the book. I don't know if you read the. I don't know if you
I
read
haven't either. I've read a couple of his other works, but I
Okay.
honestly never read Fight Club, so which
Yeah,
is
and
kind of embarrassing. But
yeah, and I don't know. I know in that podcast episode, offline, they made reference to some conversation at the time, some interviews with Edward Norton at the time, I think, where they did discuss that there was a kind of an intentional Gen X aspect to the movie. So I think there was some
mm-hmm.
definite. He had a definite point behind it. I won't claim to be real familiar with that, but that it is interesting to
Right.
ponder what the different meanings could be. So
Yeah.
it's interesting you went to religion, because one of the other things that I was thinking about then, having watched it back as a more fully formed adult, I guess I'll say. And again, I'm going to reference back to the identity episode that we did. I really keyed on the split personality aspect of it this
mm-hmm.
time,
Mm-hmm.
and to maybe really the mental health issues that Jack seemed to be experiencing. And like we talked about in that episode too, when you usually have a split personality, it's usually triggered by some trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Now they didn't fully get into anything like that in the movie. They kind of stayed away from it. So it's easy
Right.
to go, well, this movie is a reaction to capitalism, and they're rebelling against that. But I really wonder if it was or I should say, another angle to take on it, much like what you mentioned with religion, is Jack has experienced some trauma. He did mention in the scene where they're in the bathroom and Tyler's in the bathtub that his dad left him when he was 6, left their family
Mm-hmm.
when he was 6.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to react to different levels of trauma differently. Maybe it's that. Maybe there was more to it. But
Yeah.
that split personality seemed to come out as a means to live the life that Jack wishes he could, and eventually does, as he starts to merge together and bring that that other personality into his life. But I think
Mm-hmm.
about it towards the end of the movie, where I think it's towards the end where Tyler says, "I look like you want to look. I fuck like you want to fuck." You know what I mean? I'm all the things you want to be, but you're
mm-hmm.
not, basically. So, and then I think some of the people are always, when people are in a state where they feel like their life is not where they want it to be, often they will lash out against the things they think put them there, right? So if his perception is my life's mundane, then maybe it's just capitalism or society was the weight, or the thing I'm gonna blame. But who knows? It could have been a whole nother. It could have been like I said, a past trauma, whatever really initiated that other personality to emerge. Um, it's just
Yeah.
kind of like I said, a different look I had at it as watching it back now versus something I really didn't key on that aspect of it when we were younger watching it.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think for me, I wonder then if, the abandonment by his father and then creating the personality of Tyler could be essentially the stand-in for his father, because while they are friends, they're peers essentially, roughly the same age, of both have jobs, like both regular people living within this system that they both hate. um, what does Tyler do? He assumes authority. He's the one that's better looking, stronger, more wise. He has all these philosophical takes on things. He's the one giving advice. He's the one orchestrating Project Mayhem, as far as everyone knows, for the majority of the film. So essentially, that could maybe be his way of replicating a father figure through that alternate identity, then, and it's a stand-in for that, which he never really had. So I think that's a really interesting angle on looking at that, because yeah, I mean, it's a big part of it, but it's not a big part of it until the end of the film, when you realize that that's what's actually going on, and you're just reading it one way, and then all of a sudden, just the twist happens, and you find out what's really been going on. And so, but I do think that's very interesting, and I think that type of trauma, to like what you said, could be enough for some people, especially. And then you consider he's got insomnia, he's got these other things going on in his life that just kind of break down his energy, his willpower, and other things, just to kind of put up with the world, when he just finally snaps in the office and punches himself in the face, trying to, granted, that was all calculated, but you could tell he was getting to a point where he was kind of desperate, and just hadn't slept in how many ever days. And so I think all those things combined really just speaks to a person that was dealing with some severe mental challenges, and then all this stuff manifests out of that. So I think that's a very interesting take on it.
Yeah, when the film opens, he's clearly he understands in his mind he's got insomnia, but he clearly does sleep at times because
Hmm.
he's out acting as Tyler, doing a lot of the things, working the night job in the movie theaters, doing a lot of things that are being done by his body. So
Hmm.
he clearly has to be sleeping, but the difference is he's not really resting, right? Because
Right, because he's still awake
his
as
physical,
Tyler.
yeah, exactly. Um, but he's struggling to pinpoint his problems, and then Tyler emerges, to your point, kind of like a father figure, pointing a lot of these things out to him, sort of guiding him into this sort of awakening. So yeah, the father figure angles, yeah, that's a good take on that right there.
Yeah.
I hadn't even really gone there, even though I was
Okay.
thinking that the yeah. So and then it what I really paid attention to this time too, when I watched it back, and I had before, but it's so easy to think back on that movie and think of the build up, right? The early stages where he first meets Tyler, and all the Fight Club starting and all the things. But it's sometimes easy to forget about the end, which is that he really did come around to, like, wait a minute, this has gone too far. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want part of this anymore. He has to end his relationship with Tyler, and I don't know. I haven't quite landed on. He's. It's not that he doesn't have the problems, but he's
Hmm.
maybe found a, like, okay, I have issues, but it's not that bad. I don't want to take things that far. But I thought another key point that I kind of thought about as I watched it this time too was he does get together with Marla in the end. He even uses that line. He's like, "You met me at a really interesting point in my life." You know what I mean? As the buildings
Yeah.
start to crumble down, but he really did. And kind of that, there was dialogue some throughout the movie when they're again in that bathtub scene, like, oh, I'm not sure another woman is really what we need. You know what I mean? But
Hmm.
yeah, he was sort of finding happiness through her. He probably doesn't ever make that connection to her without Tyler. So there, in a way, well, that's probably not father figure so much, but it gave him the courage and because again it was the persona of him in his mind, his best self, right? The way he wants to look.
Yeah.
Pretty cool,
Hmm.
pretty cool guy. So that Brad Pitt or Tyler Durden persona gave him that courage to connect with Marlon. That was really kind of maybe what he wanted in the end. So I don't know. That could kind of come
Yeah.
back around to some of the incel things we were talking
Hmm.
about. He wasn't achieving that on his own, and the whole time he probably could have just asked her out.
Right.
But for some reason, he saw her as kind of competition to that other means of therapy he was looking for to go to those groups. And, she was
Yeah.
an imposter just like he was. So,
Yeah. Well, I think we'll end with this, and this is another expansion on the father figure idea. Is that if you think about it, a lot of us, I know everyone's experience is different, everyone's family situation is different, but I think a lot of us, especially when we're young, we kind of want to be our fathers, or at least we look up to them, we respect them, we see a lot that we like and look up to, and but then there's the point where so that in the movie, then that parallels with obviously Jack kind of being subservient to Tyler in a way, but also then looking up to him and admiring him and thinking, like you said, like he's this cool guy. And then, but then there's the point where, in no matter again, every situation is different, but in most situations, when you finally turn into your own man, there's a point where you kind of reject that connection to your father in a way, that there's something about it like that you it's almost like the coming of age where you just sort of split away, and that's when he shoots himself in the face and says, like, I this is it, I'm done with this, and I'm rejecting this and becoming my own self, my own man. And so I think that's another portrayal of that kind of cycle of family and growing up and becoming your own man and finding your own way.
yeah, you realize that you hit that point where you realize you don't just want to be like a clone version of him. You do want to break away and be your own man. Yeah, that's a good. But
Yeah.
Tyler was so resistant to letting to getting out of the way of that he had to take such
Yeah.
drastic measures to ultimately kill off that personality. Yeah,
Yeah. That's a very dramatic way to split from from your dad.
yeah. Well, it was like it was almost like symbolic of like you had to be willing to maybe end yourself too, because
Hmm.
the lead up to that scene, right, is he's saying when he's in the van and he's trying to disarm the bomb, and Tyler's like, well, you don't know which wire to cut, and he's like, well, if you know, I know, because we're the same. He'd come to that realization already that they're the same person. So he's like, if you know, then I know. And then even when they're in the building, then and he's sitting there and Tyler's got the gun, and Jack's sitting there in the chair, and he goes, no, the gun's not in your hand, the gun's in my hand. And then he looks down and he's got the gun now, right?
Yeah.
And then Tyler doesn't. So it was that sort of I'm officially taking back over right here, and this is what I'm willing to do to get you out of the picture. And
Hmm.
luckily he's pointing
Yeah.
over this way when he pointing over to the side when he sticks the gun in his mouth. But
Yeah.
um yeah, no, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. For sure. Well, I think this was an awesome discussion and a great film. And again, props to the offline podcast for really kicking this all off for us and giving us some
Yeah,
good
can I
fodder
just
to
say a little
discuss.
bit there, because I know
Yeah,
we've
absolutely.
sorry, it's Offline with John Favreau is the name of the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
Some of the people, like his partner is, I can't think of his full name, but it's Max, and so he does this sort of offshoot like film podcast with a couple other people, and I
Hmm.
should have wrote down all their names, but
Hmm.
yeah, I just want to make sure if anybody is looking for it that it's the Offline with John Favreau. I think it was from probably about a week and a half ago, maybe the episode aired, so it was probably
Like
like mid
mid
September,
September, I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Depending on what, yeah, 'cause we're not sure exactly when this one will come out of ours, but yeah. So if anybody's looking for that, yeah, total props to that. It was a great discussion. You could tell they're a little younger, and they were referring to Gen
Mm-hmm.
X as somebody other than themselves. So it was interesting to get a take on that too from people who weren't necessarily in our exact Gen X age group.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I just wanted to throw that in case anybody's going to look for it.
Yeah. Good call. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us this week, and we'll see you next time.